What if the most dangerous movement for any person, company, or civilization isn't failure? Not the struggling startup, not the failing state, not the underdog with nothing to lose. Folks, I'm talking about the winner, the dominant one, the one who figured it all out, built something remarkable, and then, precisely because it worked, couldn't stop. You see, every civilization that ever called itself permanent said the same thing at its peak. We are different. We earned this. The rules that brought others down actually don't apply to us. They were always wrong. And the most precise, most disturbing record of exactly how and why they were wrong was written by one man who watched it all happen in his own city in real time and couldn't stop it. His name was Thucydides. He was a general before he was a historian. He was exiled before he was famous, and he spent about 20 years in the wilderness writing a document so accurate about human nature that every serious student of power, from top military commanders to chief executive officers to head of state, still read it today. Not for any specific history, for the mirror. Before you understand why Athens and Sparta destroyed each other, you have to understand something that the textbooks always almost skip. Neither of them was weak, neither of them was desperate, neither of them was a failed state looking for a way out. They were two of the most successful civilizations which were ever built during that period, each internally coherent, each thriving by its own logic, each with every reason to believe that the future actually belonged to them. That is the thing that makes the story absolutely beautiful. Athens, 50 years before the war, Athens was middling, just another Greek city state, talented, competitive, perpetually rivalrous, but not dominant yet. Then the Persians invaded. The greatest empire on earth sent its army and its fleet to shallow Greece whole, and Greece, fractured, suspicious, constitutionally incapable of an agreement, somehow held together just long enough to push them back twice. Athens won the naval battle that decided it all, and everything that followed from that was just one victory. Athens used the peace to build a navy that controlled every profitable sea route in the eastern Mediterranean, an alliance city of the states, the Delian League that paid Athens tribute in exchange for protection, silver mines at Laurion pumping wealth into silver mines through the treasury, the Parathon going up to the Acrolypse at the momentum not just to the gods but to the city's own sense of destiny. Philosophers debated this in the open air. Citizens voted on legislation. A man born without a land could still have a voice in his city's future. This wasn't any kind of charity. This was a startup that found product market fit and scaled without an apology. Athens was the kind of organization that it is aggressive so much as it is relatively expansive, growing not out of malice but because growth is what happens when a working system finds space to fill. Sparta, 200 kilometers southwest, a completely different theory of civilization. Sparta had no port worth speaking of, no navy, no silver mines, no empire built on trade. What Sparta had was one of the finest land army that the world has actually ever seen, and a social architecture that made it absolutely permanent. Every Spartan male actually began military training at the age of 7, not as some kind of a punishment, but as identity. The state wasn't recognized around commerce or democracy or the life of the mind. It was organized around the single most reliable political asset a state can actually possess, the disciplined ability to project violence. When Athens was open, Sparta was closed. When Athens innovated, Sparta redefined. When Athens experimented, Sparta perfected what it already knew. Both systems worked. Both systems was producing exactly what they were designed to produce. Both had actually made their creators powerful. Now here is the thing that most people never reach. They were not natural enemies. They had fought side by side against Persia. They were capable of an alliance, of coexistence, of natural respect between theories of civilization. For decades, they were actually able to manage it. They became enemies not because of some kind of hatred, right? They became enemies because success made them incompatible. Athens growing meant Athens needed allies, and those allies were increasingly inside Sparta's orbit. Athens expanding its trade network actually meant that Athens was pulling city states towards it. In a way, a large mass actually pulls the smaller one. From Athens' perspective, this was just mere growth. From Sparta's perspective, this was a slow annexation of everything around them. The war didn't actually start with any kind of declaration, it started with a mere feeling. Rule 1: the most dangerous rivals don't actually begin with hatred, they begin with incompatibility. Two successful systems whose continued growth requires the same space. Here is the paradox that ends empire and the thing almost no one teaches correctly. Sparta wasn't wrong to actually feel threatened. Athens was growing fast. The Athenian Empire of 450 BC was unrecognizable compared to the Athens of the 840 BC. Richer, more connected, more confident, and that confidence had a way of bleeding into something harder to name. Not quite arrogance, more like the particular blindness that develops in an organization that has won so many times that it has actually stopped being able to distinguish between skill and conditions. Athens wasn't just trying to conquer Sparta, right? Athens was just growing. But just growing is precisely what an established power cannot tolerate. An established power's position depends on relative advantage. Every ally Athens adds is one Sparta might actually lose. Every trade route Athens control is one less point of leverage for Sparta. Growing without threatening anyone when you already feel large, that is not some kind of neutrality, it is a slow siege. A Harvard political scientist named Graham Allison studied 16 cases over 500 years where a rising power actually challenged an established one. 12 of the 16 ended in a war. He named the pattern that Thucydides Trap, right? After the man who first described the mechanism absolutely clearly. But Allison is also careful to say what gets lost in the headline. It is not a law of physics, it is a tendency of human psychology. The trap is not inevitable, it is just very hard to escape once you're actually inside it. And we can watch Athens and Sparta walk into it three specific moments. Each one small, each one very rational, each one read by the other as confirmation of their worst fears. Corcyra, a wealthy island with a significant navy, asked Athens for help in a war against Corinth, a Spartan ally. Athens agreed, a defensive alliance, just protection. The stated reason was protecting an ally in need. The real reason: Corcyra's navy was the third largest in Greece. Athens could not let it fall into Sparta's orbit. What Sparta heard? Athens is expanding. Again, Potidaea, a northern city that was both a member of Athens' empire and historically tied to Corinth. Athens ordered it to tear down its wall and expel Corinthian magistrates. The stated reason: security within the empire. The real reason: Athens tightening its grip on the tributaries. What Sparta actually heard was Athens is eating the edges of our world. The Megarian decrees, right? Athens banned the city of Megara from every port in the Athenian empire. Economic strangulation of a very small neighbor. And here was the stated reason: Megara had encroached on some sacred land, and the real reason was punishment for political defiance. What Sparta actually heard, or what they actually assumed, is if they do this to Megara, no city in our league is actually safe. Three incidents, one defense isolation, each one rational given Athens' interest, each one read from Sparta's position as one more data point in a pattern that could end only one way. This is the mechanism, not malice, not stupidity, rational actors who are actually reading each other rational moves as threats, responding defensively, creating new threats which prompt new responses, which build step by step, right? There's a small compounding that actually takes place, and all of this leads to one word that no single person actually choose consciously. Rule number two. In a security dilemma, rational self protection is indistinguishable from any kind of rational aggression. You cannot build a wall without looking like you're actually preparing for a war. The war starts, and Pericles has a plan. It has a good plan. It may be the only plan that could have actually worked. Pericles understood the fundamental asymmetry. Sparta's strength was its army, the finest land force in the world, devastating, disciplined, unbeatable in an open battle. Athens' strength was its navy and its treasury. Fighting Sparta on land was actually mere suicide. So Pericles' strategy was elegant in a way that only true clear thinking is elegant. Don't. When Sparta invaded Attica and began burning the farmland, Athens would not march out to actually meet them. The population would shelter behind the city walls. The navy would raid Spartan coastal towns. The empire's tribute would keep the treasury full. Sparta would exhaust itself year after year, invading land it couldn't hold, fighting a city it couldn't catch, funding a war that it couldn't afford to sustain or completely keep to themselves. It outlasted them, and that was the plan. It required something that democratic systems find almost physically painful to provide: patience under visible suffering. Athens would watch its own farms actually burn from the inside of the city walls. It would not flinch, it would not retaliate on the land, it would trust the long term game. And the plan, ladies and gentlemen, was surprisingly working. Then the plague came. Athens had pulled its rural population inside the walls as Sparta ravaged the countryside. The destiny was extraordinary. People packed into a city built for a fraction of that number. And when the disease arrived in 430 BC, a year into the war, it found conditions that could have been more perfect for it. It tore through the city. It killed tens of thousands of people. It killed the Pericles. He died with his strategy intact. He died before the Athenians actually abandoned it. Because here is where human psychology enters the story and never actually leaves. The Athenian assembly had been watching their farmlands burn for 2 years. They had watched people they loved die in a plague. They had done nothing strategically speaking except holding the line, trust the plan, and wait. Those are the words that they kept telling. And now the man who designed the plan was actually dead. Patience is not a democratic virtue. Patience requires faith in a long term strategy during a short term suffering. Democratic systems produce leaders whose survival depends on responding to what the crowd actually feels right now. Not what a dead general would actually work, would act, not what a dead general would have actually believed and said that would work in the next 3 years. After Pericles died, the assembly turned toward voices that actually promised action. Cleon, the demagogue, and later inevitably Alcibiades, the most brilliant and the most dangerous political mind of his generation. They had already sacrificed too much to stop. The farmland was gone, the treasury was actually draining, the dead were dead. To pull it back now, to do nothing again, to wait again, to again go ahead and trust a long term strategy that felt like an insult to everything already lost, felt like actually admitting that all of it had been for nothing and there's no good cause for why this damage is actually caused. Sunk cost is not an accounting error, it is a feature of human psychology that functions as a trap, and the trap had slowly started working. Athens won a significant battle at Peloponnesian in 425 BC. Sparta battered, offered peace. It was a genuine opening, a moment when Athens could have ended the war from a position of strength, with something to show for its suffering. The assembly, however, rejected the peace offer. The war still continued. Rule 3. Democratic systems are extraordinary at starting wars and absolutely terrible at finishing them. Because the crowd demands action over strategy and patience is never the popular vote. 415 BC. Athens and Sparta are in an uneasy truce, the Peace of Niceas, signed 4 years earlier. Neither side believes in it, neither side has actually disarmed. It is a kind of peace that is really just a war holding its breath. Into this fragile moments and this fragile situation actually stepped Alcibiades. He was the ward of Pericles, which means he had the finest educations Athens would actually provide and the political connection of some of the most powerful household in the city. He was by every account that survives charismatic to a degree that made rational people stop being rational in his mere presence. He was also, and this is the part that Thucydides understood completely, someone whose personal ambitions and Athens' strategic interests overlapped just enough that it was very difficult in the moment to actually tell them apart. He wanted to invade Sicily. His argument to the assembly was seductive in the way that only bad strategy can be seductive, specific enough to sound real, vague enough to promise absolutely everything. Control Sicily, right? Sicily. He said, and you control the western grain supply. You fund the war indefinitely. You encircle Sparta from a direction it actually never anticipated. The empire doesn't just survive, it grows. What he did not say was Athens had no reliable intelligence about the Cilician defenses and defeats, no clear plan for besiding a major fortified city 1400 kilometers which was away from their home, and no predefined exit strategy, and absolutely no answers for what happens if all of this just goes wrong. But here is the thing that history usually gets wrong about this moment. The assembly was not fooled. Nicias, the general who opposed the expedition, the most experienced military mind in Athens, stood up and made one of the most clearest possible arguments against it. And he listed every single risk, right, chronologically. He asked for so many ships, so many soldiers, so much money that he hoped the sheer scale of that war, of the request that he actually put forward, would go ahead and kill the entire proposal. The assembly, however, gave him every single thing that he had asked for, more than what he had asked for actually, and the crowd was not stupid, the crowd was hungry. Athens had won Salamis, Athens had won Pylos, Athens had built the greatest navy that the world had seen and turned it into an empire. Why not Sicily? Why not the Western Mediterranean? Why not all of it? Past success had become a framework through which every new risk was actually filtered, and through that framework, Sicily looked less like a gamble and more like the next obvious step that they actually had to take. 134 warships set sail, thousands of sailors, thousands of soldiers, the largest Athenian military expedition in history, and it was headed for war Athens did not need, against a city it had severely underestimated, for a strategic objective that was never actually clear. Then Alcibiades was recalled to Athens mid-voyage to face trial on charges of religious sacrilege, charges his political enemies had actually manufactured against him. He knew that the trial was rigged, he knew what the verdict could be, so he defected to Sparta. The man who designed the expedition, sold it to the assembly and led it out to the harbour, turned around and walked into Sparta's and Spartan council chamber. He told them everything, the plans, the weakness, where to apply pressure, how to fight Athens. He also advised them to occupy Decelea, a strategic position in Attica that would actually lead Sparta, maintain permanent pressure on Athens, and cutting off the silver mines at Laurion, the lifeblood of the entire bloody treasury. Sparta did exactly what he told them to do. Commander of the expedition fell to Nicias, the man who had never wanted to go, who had tried to stop it, who was now trapped in a war of his opponents, imagining with none of his original leadership's conviction. The siege of the Cycricos stalled. Sparta sent a general named Gylippus to reinforce the Syracuse, and he arrived and immediately transformed the entire defense system. Athens sent reinforcement. They failed too. Two-thirds of the fleet was actually lost. 40,000 men, soldiers and sailors killed or captured. The treasury built over generation gutted in 2 years. The most powerful democracy in the ancient world had just sent its finest military force to the wrong place at the wrong time for unclear reasons, and commanded by a man who tried to prevent it after its architect and fundamental system and the framework had defected to the particular enemy. And every single step of it had been voted on in public in a functioning democracy with full information available to every single person in that particular society. This is what hubris actually looks like. Not a cartoon villain, not arrogance for its own sake. The most experienced, most capable, most intelligent people in a society extrapolating from a long run of genuine success and failing to notice that the environment had quietly, fundamentally changed. Theronas raised hundreds of millions of dollars from sophisticated investors across 16 years before anyone had actually asked hard questions about the actual technology. Lehman Brothers posted record profits 12 months before it ceased to exist. WeWork was actually valued at $47 billion by people who had done their actual due diligence. In every single case, past success became the lens, and the lens bent every single thing that it actually touched. Rule number 4. Hubris is not arrogance. It is the rational extrapolation of past success into a future that has quietly changed. The longer the winning streak, the harder it is to actually see the rules have actually shifted and are actually not working in your favor. After Sicily, Alcibiades kept moving. He had served Athens, then he sold Athens to Sparta, but even Sparta couldn't actually hold him. He made the mistake of sleeping with the wife of the Spartan king, and suddenly he was unwelcomed there too. So he moved on to Persia, where he offered his services to the Persian government dishamference. He gave Persia the same thing he'd given to every single person: strategic advice, perfectly calibrated to actually ensure that no single power actually dominated the entire war situation. Because the moment one side dominated, Alcibiades became expendable, right? And he needed the war to continue. His survival actually was actually completely dependent on being the most useful man in a world that actually still needs him. He returned to Athens briefly when political winds shifted in his favor, took command of the fleet, won several important battles, and was celebrated as a savior. Then, while he was away from his fleet, a subordinate lost a schism and he was exiled again. He died in 404 BC, the year the war ended, the year Athens surrounded in a small house in Potidaea, right? Killed by a man who was actually hired by enemies he had made in too many places to actually track, and he was not yet 50. Thucydides called him the most gifted politician of his age. He was also the single most destructive force in the Athenians' collapse, not because he was some kind of a villain, right? But because his extraordinary talent served only himself, and Athens was the vehicle he drove until it actually completely broke. After Sicily, Athens did not break and was still ready to fight, and this was the time that it actually unrivaled. Allies who had stayed loyal out of confidence in the Athenian power now quietly recalculated. Sparta, flush with Alcibiades, right, and its intelligence and Persian gold, it actually built a real navy for the first time and challenged Athens at the sea. The one domain, Athens had always considered themselves to be absolutely powerful and absolutely untouchable. Inside the city, the pressure of the war amplified every existing fracture: democratic fraction against oligarchic fraction, hawks against doves, right? The street against the assembly. In 411 BC, a coup suspended the democracy. It was restored, then challenged again, then a second coup attempted, then the restoration actually happened again. Think about what it does to a society when the institution keeps failing and kept getting rebuilt. The damage is not the failure, the damage is what the failure does to the trust. When people can no longer assume that the institutions around them will function predictably, that the rules will hold, that the vote will matter, that the government will still be the same government next month, the rational response is to actually stop committing, stop investing, stop trusting the next leader's promises, because the last leader's promises turned out to be contingent. That withdrawal of trust is not weakness, it is intelligence, and it is exactly the kind of right response to an unreliable system. And it is also how a civilization hollows out from inside. Maybe this is also the start of the downfall of the civilization. Athens surrendered itself in 404 BC. The long walls, the great fortifications that had protected the city and its port was actually completely torn down. A Spartan backed oligarchy was installed. The democracy that had built the Marathon and won the Salamis, produced Socrates and Pericles and Thucydides, was completely over and completely destroyed. Sparta had won. But here is what Sparta's victory actually was, and what almost no history class actually teaches. Sparta won a war of exhaustion. It had outlasted a democratic empire, but outlasting someone is not the same as replacing them. Sparta had no model for governing an empire, no philosophical tradition, no trade network, no system of government that other city states wanted to adopt. It had the finest army in the world and no idea about what the peacetime was supposed to look like, and they actually had no projection in their head as well. Within about 30 years, Sparta's power had collapsed. The rigid social system that had made its military absolutely extraordinary made its recovery absolutely impossible, unable to adapt, unable to replenish, right? Unable to grow into whatever actually came next. Sparta won and then discovered that winning a war is not the same as knowing what to do with the world after you've actually won the war. And that is where I come to rule number 5. And rule number 5 says that civilizations rarely die from the outside. They die when internal coherence breaks down, when citizens stop agreeing on what is worth defending, and institutions stop consuming what to trust more than they actually produce. Start consuming more trust than they actually produce. Thucydides was not some kind of a philosopher. He was not trying to give anyone comfort. He was not writing to inspire or to warm or to make any moral argument whatsoever. And these are actually the same reasons why I'm doing this video, right? Because I'm not considering any of this as to be one of my metrics. He was just trying to diagnose, and that's what we're trying to do here as well. He had served as a general and lost his city, a Spartan assault, when he was far away to relieve in the time. Athens exiled him for it. He spent 20 years outside the city that he'd actually loved, talking to participants on both sides, watching what the war produced, and writing the account that would carry his name for 2.5 millennia. What he conducted, the thing he dared to write down when everyone else was still constructing honorable narratives about why their side was actually right, is this: strip away ideology, strip away every single ideology, every stated rationale, every claim of justice or civilization or righteous defense. Under all of it, in every actor, in every decision, you will find 3 things: fear, honor, interest, not in sequence, simultaneously, all the time. Fear is the most powerful and the most underrated of the 3. What made war inevitable was the Athenian aggression, not the Spartan bloodlust. But the fear the Athenian growth instilled in Sparta was the fear that if it actually did nothing, The world would reconfigure itself around Athenians and Sparta and would wake up one day surrendered, right? Sparta did not go into the war because it actually hated Athens. Like we discussed previously, this was not the agenda itself. It went to war because inaction felt more dangerous than action, and that is the distinction that matters enormously. Hatred can sometimes be addressed. Fear, especially the kind of grows, especially the one that actually grows from watching someone else succeed, is the most impossible to actually reason with, because it is not based on what the other side has done. It is based on what the other side could possibly do in the future. Honor, what we would call today prestige or reputation or brand, is the driver that makes conflicts actually last longer than they actually should. Athens could not accept a negotiated peace after the plague became withdrawal and would actually look like some kind of weakness. Sparta could not accept Athenian naval supremacy because to do so they would actually have to concede the fundamental argument about which civilization actually deserved to lead Greece. Honor turns every exit triumph into a trap, right? The cost of walking away from a losing position is unbearable when walking away means admitting that you are actually wrong. Interest, money, territory, resources, trade routes, it is actually fewer of those attributes that every single person talks about because it's the most visible and the most legible. But interest is usually the justification of the jurisdiction, right? It's the respectable language that power uses to describe what fear and honor are actually driving. These three things did not stop operating when Athens actually surrendered. They are just running, and they're actually running right now in every capital, in every boardroom, in every single organization, in every single market that have grown large enough to notice each other. A generation of scholars has built a framework around this pattern. When rising power challenges an established one, when the new threatens to displace the old, the three drivers Thucydides named kick in simultaneously, and on both sides, reinforcing each other, and the probability of violent conflict rises sharply. 12 of the last 16 major power transitions over 5 centuries ended in a war. Not because war was inevitable, but because the pattern is real, and the pattern is hard to interrupt, because interrupting it requires both sides to act against their immediate rational interests simultaneously, and history gives us very few examples of that actually happening. Right now, the United States and China are the most prominent example of this dynamic playing out in real time. China has grown at a rate that no established power in history has been able to ignore. The United States responded with trade restrictions, technology controls, and military repositioning in the Pacific. China has responded to those responses, right? And each side, by its own account, it is simply protecting its interest. Each side's rational behavior looks from the other side like the opening move of something much larger. Does that sound familiar? The question Thucydides couldn't answer, and neither can we, is whether knowing the pattern is actually enough to interrupt it or to do some kind of interpretation. Whether the self-awareness that the pattern requires is something more than human political systems are actually capable of actually producing, or for a human man to actually think and conceive. He was skeptical, not clinical. He didn't think humans were incapable of wisdom. He just thought that the incentive structure around power made wisdom very, very, very difficult to actually act on. And even when everyone in the room understood what was happening, that scenario rarely actually kicked in. Rule number 6: fear, honor, and interest are the opening and the operating system of human political behavior. The surface changes, the technology, the ideology, the language, the century, and the code does not. Why are we still reading Thucydides? Not because the past is, very fascinating. The past is not fascinating, and if you've heard me till now, you know that this is absolutely boring. The past is the only data that we actually have for our understanding of what humans do when their stakes are total, right? When survival, power, and identity, all of them together simultaneously are on the table, and the data says something that is genuinely hard to sit with. We have not changed. Not in the ways that matter here.